Hey, what's up YouTube? What's going on? In today's new video, what I wanted to do is have a discussion around the sport of CrossFit. And the reason I wanted to make this video is because I feel like CrossFit itself is a sport that gets bashed on a lot by a lot of people in the health and fitness industry. And I can understand where these individuals are coming from, because when you take CrossFit itself, it combines Olympic lifting and powerlifting and puts them together into one sport, and you're performing a lot of high volume of these lifts. And so when you're performing a lot of high volume Olympic lifts and power lifts, one could be putting themselves at a significant risk for injury, especially if they're not qualified to be doing those lifts. Now, I'll kind of share my thoughts on that, but before I kind of get into that, at the same time, there's a lot of people out there that love CrossFit. They love the fact that they're performing a lot of high volume lifts, and they just overall love the whole community concept around CrossFit itself in terms of getting a workout in and just being surrounded by other like-minded individuals in the sport. And so I think that's one of the great things that CrossFit does, is the community that it builds. Now, with regards to my opinion on CrossFit itself, I'm not against it. I don't have a problem with it. Personally, the way I view CrossFit is it's a sport itself, just like powerlifting is a sport, just like Olympic lifting is a sport, just like basketball is a sport, just like hockey is a sport. Now, with that being said though, the issue that I have is, with regards to CrossFit, is when we start putting the wrong population into CrossFit. So CrossFit athletes should train to become CrossFit athletes. You should not have a basketball athlete, baseball athlete, or a soccer athlete being put into a CrossFit workout. And the reason I say that is because if you take these athletes, whatever sport they're from, and you put them into CrossFit, you could now be impacting their performance for their primary sport in a negative way, because now we're training for a different sport in itself. And while that could take away from performance, because now we're developing maybe different energy systems, or now we're stressing different joints or putting more stress on certain joints that may now carry over into our primary sport. Now we may be a little bit more beat up, and we could be at a greater risk for injury, or we could maybe sustain an injury in CrossFit as a result of maybe a lot of the stress we've already accumulated in our primary sport. So there's where I have the issue with CrossFit, and it's more so just the context. It isn't an issue with the sport itself, it's the context that one may be applying it to a different sport, or maybe a different population for that matter. The thing with CrossFit too is that it's not for everybody, and quite frankly, only a small portion of the population is really qualified to be involved in CrossFit and to be performing power lifts and Olympic lifts as seen in the sport itself. The thing with powerlifting and the thing with Olympic lifting is there is a lot of technique that goes into those various lifts. And we could break things down in terms of every lift itself, but we could look at maybe hip mobility. Do you have the adequate shoulder mobility, core stability to really get into the positions to be doing a hang clean or a snatch or a deadlift? Do you really have the appropriate needs or requirements to be getting into those positions to be doing those lifts under load? And so that is where we need to kind of look at things and keep things in mind, because quite frankly, a lot of people do not have the appropriate qualifications to be putting themselves into those lifts. And that's where CrossFit kind of gets a bad reputation, in my opinion, is because there may be a lot of bad CrossFit trainers out there or coaches out there that are putting individuals who are not qualified into these lifts. And then the next thing you know, these individuals that are not qualified to be performing these lifts sustain an injury. And then the people that sustain an injury now may get mad at the trainer, and they also may get mad at the sport and say CrossFit's the worst, it screwed my shoulder up, it screwed my back up, or whatever injury they may have sustained. And I think it's that feedback that really kind of kicks back and develops that bad reputation or bad mindset around CrossFit. And if you look to the research, and if you look to the injury kind of rates in CrossFit, I believe that shoulder injuries are the most prevalent, and then the spine would be number 2. There was a research study in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning actually looking at this. Don't quote me on that, but I know that it was similar in terms of injury rates to other sports such as Olympic lifting and powerlifting, I believe. but don't quote me on that, but just wanted to share that. Because if you do look to shoulder injuries being common, it would make sense in terms of a lot of the overhead lifting that these individuals are doing, but also spine injuries as well when you consider squatting or deadlifting. Now, just to use an example from other sports, if you were to look to maybe a sport like hockey, where you have hockey players always engaging in a lot of lumbar flexion or spinal flexion, and these individuals already tend to have bad lower backs if you look at the career or at the end of their career. So putting them into a sport or another activity that already has a high risk of spine injuries wouldn't exactly make sense. At the same time, you could look to a sport like basketball or baseball where it's an overhead sport, and we know in CrossFit that it's an overhead sport as well, but the injury rates for CrossFit, the shoulder tends to be the most significant or highest area of injury. So taking a baseball or basketball athlete, putting him to a sport where there's a lot of demands on the shoulder doesn't exactly make sense. So that's where the context comes into play. So what I wanted to just kind of talk about is that when it comes to CrossFit, I have nothing against it. It's just the context matters in terms of how you are implementing CrossFit, and if you are a CrossFit athlete yourself. If you're a CrossFit athlete, then train to be a CrossFit athlete. If you're a basketball athlete, train to be a basketball athlete. If you're a hockey athlete, train to be a hockey athlete. Because when we start crossing things over, and when we start taking individuals who are not qualified to be doing lifts, such as Olympic lifts or power lifts, especially in high volume, we may only be putting these individuals at a high risk for injury, and we wonder why the injury rate is very high in CrossFit itself already. It's because a lot of individuals that are not qualified to be doing these lifts are performing these lifts and performing CrossFit. So I think that's where the problem kind of develops and why CrossFit gets a bad reputation from a lot of people. And what I find is people either love CrossFit or they hate CrossFit. And I'm just kind of in the middle. I have an open mind to it. Nothing against the sport. That's your sport, train for your sport. If it's not your sport, then don't train for it, because you may only be affecting your performance and putting yourself at a greater risk for injury. Now, to kind of wrap this whole video up and to touch on CrossFit, the one other thing to consider too is if you're considering maybe doing CrossFit just at a recreational point of view, you may also want to consider what maybe the long-term outcomes of this type of activity may be if you're looking to maybe maintain your health and you don't want problems down the road. Now that could be said for any sport as well: hockey, basketball, baseball, Olympic lifting, powerlifting. What are the long-term outcomes of me doing all these Olympic lifts, power lifts at a recreational point of view? Now sure, from an elite level point of view, if that's your sport and that's your career, then go for it. But from a recreational point of view, for someone that's looking to stay healthy, just something to think about. I mean, look at myself. I suffered a disc herniation. I understand the risks of returning to lifting and weightlifting, specifically heavy deadlifting. Now, is it the best for me? Probably not in terms of the long term, but I just personally wanted to get back to that activity because I wanted to prove to myself that I could get back to heavy deadlifting and prove to others, and also provide motivation to others who may be looking to get back to a sport such as powerlifting, that they can do it after sustaining a lower back injury such as a deadlift. And also just because I'm a coach myself, and the deadlift is a lift that I need to teach to others. So if I can't perform the deadlift, then how am I supposed to coach it to others or teach it to others if I don't know how to perform it properly or can't even perform it myself? Anyways, that was just a side thought, but overall, CrossFit's your sport, then albeit, go for it. Those are just my thoughts on it, and I just wanted to share that. But same time, love to hear your thoughts, guys. Are you involved in CrossFit? Have you ever performed CrossFit? I would love to hear your opinions as well and have a discussion amongst those lines. Okay, guys, so with that being said, we'll wrap it up for the video. I wish you guys all the best and a successful and productive day, and take care.